Hi, Michael. I'm so excited to have you today on the show and talk about the business of autism. But before we dive into the technical stuff, can you tell the audience a little bit about yourself and your background?
Absolutely. Thanks for having me. My name is Michael Rudy, DC native, born and raised. I went to George Mason University, which is right in the DC suburbs, and then the University of Maryland, which is also kind of in the Maryland side of the DC suburbs. Played basketball at George Mason University and married with a son and two dogs, live out in Herndon, Virginia now.
So, Michael, how did you get into the business of autism? Like, what inspired you to do ally behavior?
Absolutely. So my wife, Brittany, is a clinician. So she's the one who's doing the real work, working with the kids. And we met at Mason in undergrad and started dating then. And when she got out of Mason, she joined a company that I think could be described as a body shop. They put her in a home working with a kid with no training and kind of not the proper level of support. And they were just billing for her time. And she's working with this kid, and the supervisor is kind of writing updates and programs for that kid without coming to see the kid. And my wife's trying to explain, hey, this is wrong. This isn't, if you just came and saw the kid, you'd understand this program doesn't make any sense. But that supervisor was stretched super thin. They had a huge caseload. And so I'm doing graduate school in chemical engineering, and Brittany tells me about this. And I go, hold on, this can't be kind of the status quo for treating kids with autism in America. That sounds very backwards and really wrong. And so she moved on to a nonprofit for a while, and I was finishing up chemical engineering. When I got out of chemical engineering, I had worked for a life science startup and found that I really liked startup. So I came back to Brittany and I said, hey, I still think there's probably a huge need for quality services in the area. What if we teamed up and you do the clinical side and I do the business side? Did a little due diligence, talking with local pediatricians and other people in the field, and kind of confirmed that there's just a huge need for quality service providers, and then teamed up and did that with Brittany tackling kind of the clinical side and me doing more of the business related side of building Ally, and got the business going.
Was there a specific gap also that you were trying to fill in? You said that the quality of care was not good where she was working, right?
So the industry, particularly back in 2019, was very new. So the medical billing codes were Category 3 experimental, and they were being changed to Category 1 just standard medical billing codes. So you go and get your knee replaced, there's a standard code for that. The codes to treat autism were going from the maybe this is a thing to these are set as a thing. And so because the industry was new, there was one, just a lack of providers. There were so many kids who had autism and there weren't enough providers to cover all those kids. And two, there was just variable provider quality, and there weren't kind of set expectations for what quality services look like. And so hearing about my wife's experience first at the first company and then at the nonprofit, which was well-intentioned but had some issues that plague nonprofits, I thought that there was an opportunity just to build a quality service provider focused on doing things the right way. I kind of checked that thesis by I started with the pediatrician I went to growing up as a kid and asked hey, what's the state? If you get to with autism, what do you do? If you have any, families who'd be willing to speak with me, I'd love to hear about their experience. And in chatting with different families and different providers, it was just clear that there was a huge need for quality service providers. And there was, at the time, a huge lack of center-based programs too. Most of the programs were in-home. And so we just said, hey, let's just build a quality center-based program to work with young kids who have autism.
So right now, your center is in which area?
We have 10 facilities in the DC area. Kind of all around the DC and Baltimore metro areas, kind of as far north as White Marsh, Columbia, Maryland, Beltsville, Maryland, Rockville, Maryland, down into Springfield and Chantilly, Herndon, Virginia, Tysons, Virginia.
Wow. And what year did you start this company?
I started in September of 2019.
Wow. So in 7 years, you've expanded to almost 10 facilities. That's fantastic.
I've had awesome people to help get me there, but yeah, it's definitely been a labor of love. It's been really fulfilling to do and to see.
That's great. And Michael, finding affordable autism care for children and also having access to good insurance that covers therapy for autistic kids is really difficult, especially for families who can't afford it. How does your company try to advocate for these families, and how do you work with insurance companies in making sure that they cover this kind of therapy for these families?
Sure. So I think getting access to care was significantly harder in the early 2000s and 2010s because there weren't state mandates for the coverage of care. Today, all 50 states mandate insurances cover autism care. Now, sometimes there are carve outs where, certain grandfathered plans don't have to cover autism care, but we see the vast majority of commercial plans are mandated to require and kind of do mandated to cover and do kind of willingly cover care for kids with autism above the mandated minimums because they see that therapy works and the kids make progress and it saves on long-term medical costs. So if a family comes to us and they've got one of these grandfathered plans or one of these kind of exception small group plans that doesn't need to cover care, we will work to educate them with here are the plans that cover care. If it's within your financial resources, you could buy a plan during the next open enrollment. Is your spouse or significant other on a different plan that you could switch the kids' coverage to? Maybe mom's plan doesn't cover it, but dad's plan does, and you switch them over. And so we'll work with them to try to work that out. If buying coverage on open enrollment isn't something that they can do, we'll look at, is your family situation, would it be eligible for Medicaid, and advise the parents on their different options. Ally accepts Medicaid, kind of the most impacted families who are kind of don't have resources and access to care can come to an Ally, and we'll also accept kind of virtually every commercial plan that's active in the DC area. And then the patient responsibility piece, it's an intensive service, so most families end up owing about their out-of-pocket maximum, which really varies plan by plan. And it's a little bit of a double whammy where generally the families that are least well off have the highest out-of-pocket maximums, not always, but generally. And so we have need-based financial aid basically for those families where they can go on payment plans, or if their insurance allows it and there's kind of a demonstrated need for it, we can waive portions of their required payment. But each payer has its own rules for how you have to treat its members. And we've got kind of set policies to prove financial need. It's not just like, oh, hey, this is a struggle. We're going to collect income and family house size and where you are against the federal poverty line, and then make a kind of formulaic driven decision on what we can offer the family. Obviously, Medicaid families, they don't have fiscal responsibility to do care.
Got it. The quality of the ABA therapy relies heavily on skilled therapists. So what's your approach to attracting and retaining BCBAs, RBTs who are not only qualified but also passionate about helping autistic children? Because I know it's very difficult to find nurses, skilled therapists, and having like the right intention these days.
Absolutely. And I think that's kind of the name of the game and every company's biggest challenge. I think Ally has a few things working for it that maybe some other companies don't. The first thing is that I own Ally. We're not owned by like a larger financial institution who's really trying to push growth. And so I think one of the things I'm most proud of is, and this might sound funny, but the people we don't hire. So we're never like, oh my gosh, we have to hire someone to meet a growth target. If we don't feel like somebody's going to come in and be what you described, somebody who's intrinsically passionate about the therapy they're providing or going to be a really high quality provider, my people are always empowered to say no, so that we're only hiring the best people we find. And we're not ever just hiring somebody to hit a growth goal, because growth is directly related to how many clinicians you have, right? So there's always that temptation of like, oh, we could just hire more clinicians and grow faster and serve more kids. But if you're not serving kids with the right quality of clinician, ultimately, I think you're kind of doing harm to the field. The RBT role is a very challenging role. You're working directly with the kid for hours every day. The kids are often moderately to severely impacted. And so it's not a laid back, chill job. You're on your feet, you're engaging with the kid. There's no downtime. And so we try to create a place where you have a career in front of you that you can take advantage of if you want, where we'll do tuition reimbursement. And then with that master's degree, they can kind of pursue becoming a more senior clinician, whether that's a BCBA, speech, or OT. And so you give people upward mobility. And I think that really energizes the people that you really want to be at your company, or the people who want to move up in the field and become more senior clinicians. And so I think that certainly helps with retention. We salary all of our RBTs. A lot of companies will pay technicians on an hourly basis so that, if the client cancels, and the cost risk is transferred to your staff. And so I think that that's really helpful and really appreciated by some of our clinicians. And then we have a bunch of structured internal competency checks and learning and development programs so that when somebody's coming in, we're tracking everyone's progress on, are they doing the things they should be able to do clinically? And if they're not there yet, there's a structured plan in place to get them there. And if they can't get there, we will part ways with them, because at the end of the day, we have an obligation to our families and our kids. And so if somebody can't pass our internal competency checks, it's not fair to that family to just keep that staff member on, even if they're a great person and really fun to hang out with. At the end of the day, we're trying to provide the best quality of care. And I think that the people that you want on your team who really are passionate about the field, they appreciate all of these things. It's like good players want to be on a team with other good players. And so, and if you let a bad player on the team, that kind of alienates the good players. And if people aren't being held to standards, that alienates your good people. And so it's all of these things working together.
Wow. So, Michael, I want to go back to the business of autism because we're trying to focus on the business side more than the clinical side in today's podcast. So, what exactly is your business model? Is your company setting up daycare specifically for autistic kids, or is it a school? You did give us some information about BCBAs and RBTs. I don't think everybody knows exactly what BCBs and RBTs do. So, if you could talk a little bit about their qualifications and what each one does with the children.
Sure, absolutely. We run clinics. We focus on early intervention. And so our kids are from diagnosis age, which can be as young as 18 months, up till 5 or 6 years old when they're transitioning to go to kindergarten. And the clinics, they look kind of like a daycare. It's not a daycare, it's a clinic, but you're dealing with a bunch of very young kids. And so you're going to have very similar kind of furniture and toys in a daycare versus one of our clinics. And then to answer your question on the staffing, so in ABA therapy, that's the kind of golden standard for autism care. You've got the BCBAs, that stands for Board Certified Behavior Analyst. This is somebody who's got a master's or doctorate degree, who's passed a board certification to be able to practice the therapy of behavior analysis. And they are the senior clinicians who will, get a new client, they'll assess that kid, they'll write up a treatment plan, and then that treatment plan will be delivered by a behavior technician under the supervision of that board certified behavior analyst. So the behavior technician or registered behavior technician, RBT, I think that kind of a similar role is kind of a paraprofessional in a school. If you're familiar with a paraprofessional in a school, somebody who's working one-on-one with the kid, you have to have at least a high school diploma to be a RBT. Most of our clinicians have their college degree. I'd say the average profile is a young person who came out of school with a psychology degree or a family science degree or something like that. So yeah, those are the two roles. We also employ speech therapists, occupational therapists, speech therapists, help with articulation and speaking, kind of as the name implies. Occupational therapists help with fine motor skills and sensory issues that the kids have. And so we also have licensed psychologists and developmental pediatricians to really kind of have the full suite of clinicians to work with a kid to meet all of their different needs.
So for example, if I come into your office, is there a certain process you follow that the child meets a psychologist first, a speech therapist, everybody evaluates, and then you create a plan for them?
So we do diagnostic evaluations. So if you were to come and you say, hey, our pediatrician said that, we should maybe get tested for autism, then we would link you up with a developmental pediatrician or a psychologist first, where they would do that diagnostic evaluation and run a series of standardized tests and observation to determine if the child has autism or not. That's going to be the first point of contact. Then when kids enroll in Ally, they're typically doing the ABA evaluation first, because we don't want it to be, for maybe a little bit of relative context, a child will receive 30 to 40 hours of ABA a week, and then maybe an hour to 2 hours of speech or OT per week, right? And so ABA is kind of the vast majority of the care. Not that speech and OT are not kind of important, critical parts of that, but we always focus on getting the insurance approval for ABA first right away. And then as a kid gets started, setting up a time for speech and OT to assess that kid and also submit their approvals for insurance. But we don't want to delay a kid's treatment because the speech therapist wasn't available at this time to do kind of a multidisciplinary assessment on the same day, right? We always want to get them in kind of the core care program, and then kind of quickly after that, get the speech and OT services going.
Got it. So, we talked about your centers, they're more like daycares, but clinics, right? Clinics that look like daycare. So the children who come in are starting from 18 months. Until what age do you provide care?
It depends on how quickly they make progress. So, we've had kids come in at 18 months and they do awesome. And by, 2.5, they're out of there. And that's exactly what we want, right? There are kids who are with us until 5 or 6 when they're going to transition to kindergarten. Depends on if they defer kindergarten for a year or not. And so progress with kids with autism is nonlinear often. And so sometimes some kids just kind of skyrocket, make tons of progress. Some kids will make progress and then regress a bit, and then make progress and regress a bit. And it can be a little bit more of a kind of like an upward wave trend that the kid might need to be in therapy for a longer period of time.
So you don't have children older than 6 or 7 years right now?
No, we only focus on early intervention because at that age group, kids have the most neuroplasticity. And so basically therapy makes the biggest difference for affecting the trajectory of their life. And so when my wife and I looked at the field and what we could do, we said, hey, we want to be the best at delivering services where it makes the highest impact. And I think that, if you think about it, like treating a 2-year-old who's severely impacted is very different than treating a 16-year-old who's severely impacted, or even a 12-year-old who's moderately impacted. They're different skill sets. And so if you're trying to do all of those things, it's very hard to be dialed in and be the best, because with the 2-year-old, you might not be getting any engagement. So you really have to work on kind of your play-based skills and engagement and kind of coaxing behaviors out of that kid. Where with a 16-year-old, that child might be aggressive. And so if you're handling a 16-year-old who's 6'3" and 185 pounds and aggressive, it's just a very different skill set than a 2-year-old who's not engaging at all. And so again, we want to be the best at what we do, and we think that kind of focus in on early intervention allows us to hire people who really want to do that. And by the way, some people love working with the older kids, and early intervention is not their speed, right? So we're only hiring people who are jazzed about early intervention, and then we can just set up a bunch of structures and processes to ensure that our training is all oriented towards the skills you need for early intervention.
So do you provide any kind of references or recommendations to parents for care after the early intervention, like after they pass the 6-7 year mark? Because from my understanding, you need lifelong therapy. So do you have tie-ups with other companies similar to yourself that deal with kids who are older?
Yeah, they will do a kind of comprehensive report at transition out of our program. And what that report looks like really is different for every kid. I mean, there are kids who are going to need very minimal or no continued services when they leave us, and there are kids who are going to need substantial support when they leave us, and kind of everything in between. And so those recommendations are going to be different depending on the state that kid is in. The clinicians will work with the parents saying, you're transitioning to school, you're going to want to work with an in-home therapy company. Given that your kid's going to have continued needs, you're going to want to get on their wait list now, even though it's a year out, so that then once you get off the wait list, you can start therapy right away. Here are different private placement options if you're kind of able to consider options that aren't public school. Often, if a child leaves us and is heading into the public school system, there's a whole process to get private placement and have the school system fund that. And so they'll point them in the right direction, but ultimately, that the parent has to make that decision and go on that journey for themselves. Again, it really depends on some parents. You might imagine some parents come to us, they're super on top of it. They know exactly what they want. I want my kid at this school, to this school district, this teacher. And other parents are like, hey, I have no clue. What should I do? And so, we try to develop central processes to guide parents through that process in the best way possible, while also, at the end of the day, it's the parent's choice and decision for whatever they choose to do. And so you have to respect that as well.
Sure. No, that makes sense. And Michael, what do you think has contributed to Ally Behavior's success? Like, what is that unique, part of your service that makes you stand out and you've done so well? Centers is a lot in the DC area. So how do you think you've been so successful?
So I think kind of the founding principle that we started with did help not only orient the decisions we made, but also attract awesome people to work with and partner with that Ally. And that founding principle was like, hey, we're going to do the right thing, right? We're going to structure our program the right way. We're going to give the right support to the kids and to the staff, and just try to orient everything around, the program that my wife wished she had when she came out of school. Much easier said than done, but we've kind of worked towards that every day since we founded the company. I think that a couple of things that parents really appreciate about Ally is that interdisciplinary service model where we have the ABA, the speech, the OT, the psychology, the pediatrics all under one roof. And so there is just, it's like if your ABA provider and your speech provider work at different companies, they can talk about collaboration, but it's very different than both of them sitting next to each other in the office and kind of collaborating on like, hey, I'm seeing this with Timmy. What are you seeing? Very different than I got to set up a call and I got to call you at 5:45 and it's the end of a long day. It's just, so I think that the collaboration between our clinicians is tighter than when you're part of a different company. I think that the parent's life is made easier because they don't have to shuttle their kid between different services. And I, again, go back to just, it's like who we choose not to hire. and just being very focused on only hiring people who want to be here for the right reasons, not only on the clinical side, but very importantly on the corporate side too, right?
Michael, we talked about what your clinics are like, who do you hire, how do you hire them, and also how you stand out amongst the other therapy companies. But I want to hear about the challenges you faced when you were setting up your first center or your second center. I know it just gets easier after the second or third center because you kind of have a roadmap ready, but what were the challenges you faced?
Sure. So the timing, I started September of 2019. And so I got going, you get your first few kids and you feel like you hit a rhythm and you kind of know what you're doing. And then kind of March of 2020, COVID hits. And so I do think that added a ton of challenges and pressure and stress that are kind of above and beyond the normal. Anytime you start a business, any entrepreneur will tell you it's a very hard journey and a lot of things can go wrong. But with COVID, we're getting up and going, and the rules are changing for what counts as exposure and how long people have to quarantine. And so that's changing on a week by week basis. People didn't understand the long term effects. And so, and our therapy service has to be delivered in person, right? Like our kids are so young and impacted by autism that they can't just do a telehealth session and have that be effective for their development. And they're also not getting those years back. I mentioned earlier that the early intervention window of 18 months to 6 is the most impactful for affecting a kid's trajectory of where they'll end up in fulfilling their potential. And so we couldn't just kind of pause and say like, hey, we're going to take 2 years off and come back and help your kid in 2 years. They're going to miss kind of 2 critical years for their life. And so it was a stressful time with staff, getting started because somebody would come in and the next day they're like, hey, I don't feel well, and it's a positive COVID case. And people would understandably be upset. So that was challenging to work through. I'm glad those days are over. I think that there are different ways to start a business. Some people raise a bunch of money and get a business started. I did more of a bootstrapped approach where I really didn't raise much money at all. And so for a lot of starting the business, it was just me going. And so it's like you have to move every ball forward by yourself. And so you have to kind of be disciplined and make a list of, hey, here's what we have to do. We need to get more clients. And so how can we get more clients? And then I need to make sure I've got a clinician hired to work with that kid. And then I need to make sure that when we work with that kid, we bill insurance and we get paid, which can be quite a headache. Anyone who knows anything about insurance billing knows that the payers don't make it easy to get paid for your services. And then you've got to kind of, on an ongoing basis, manage your clinicians. And so just juggling between all of those things was challenging. The book Traction really helped me wrap my mind around how to structure a business. The other book that I read that made a huge impact on getting going was Who, which is a book focused on hiring and how do you evaluate candidates and how do you find somebody who's a match for what you need for the business. Initially, when I started hiring, my first hire was awesome. She's super talented, super hardworking, and really helped. And so I was like, oh my gosh, people are the key to everything. And that's something I still believe, where it's like you get a good person. If you think about it, you could work no matter how hard you work. If you have two really good people who also work hard, you can't work more hours than they can, right? You just can't outwork two people. And then you get to 3, 5, or 10. And so as your role as entrepreneur, it's, growing that business through the people you hire to help kind of leverage your vision. And so I was like, made that first hire, went really well. That was awesome. Then went through a string of hires that were a little bit more challenging and they weren't a good fit. And the reality was at the time, I didn't know how to evaluate people. I didn't know how to evaluate experience. And even when they came, I was new to managing. So I had a hard time setting expectations. I had a hard time following through. There was a lot of external stress because of COVID. And so you're kind of like picking, what battle do I want to fight today? This person maybe isn't doing their job to the level that they should be. But also there was a case of COVID and I have to deal with that and deal with the contact tracing and make sure staff are all right and make sure families are informed. And so those early days, it's just your list of things to do is infinitely long and it's all coming back to you. And so I think that's just inherently challenging. As we got bigger, I was able to refine my approach to hiring and really find who was going to be an awesome fit at Ally and on the teams.
Yeah. And have you considered expanding beyond the DC area?
So we actually are in Texas. So we have a center in Austin, Texas. We had a really, really talented clinician relocate down there for family. And she said she wanted to open up an Ally down there. And so we're opening up an Ally down in Austin. Super excited about that.
So is it a
Um,
franchise that other people can, come to you and buy?
no, it's all corporately centrally owned. She just
Okay.
loved Ally and loved being part of the team and said, hey, what if I just did a clinic down here in Texas? And so, but the corporate back office is kind of providing all of the infrastructure and she's providing the clinical leadership there.
And do you think the challenges in ensuring like quality care and, finding skilled people is similar to what it was here? Is it the same in Texas?
So the field is much more mature now than it was in 2019. Just in the last 5 or 6 years, there are thousands and thousands more practitioners than there were. And so certainly some of those challenges have gotten easier over the years because they're just the number of people doing this kind of work has significantly increased. So Texas is a more mature market. I think they had coverage for autism earlier and they had an industry form a little earlier. So we have found it easier to find super talented people to partner with quickly down there. But we'll see kind of how that continues to shake out as we grow.
Do you think autism is like a hot industry or business to be in right now? And a lot of young people are trying to become BCBAs to get into this business.
I think that because of the mandates and funding, it has been a very rapidly growing field. And
Mhm.
just the number of children who have autism, I believe the estimates are around to, I think it might be 1 in 32. That's just a lot of kids, right? So there's a huge need. A lot of kids need services, and there's now funding for services. And so that has led to more and more people getting into the field because there are more and more jobs available.
So you,
And so
sorry, you're saying government funding, right, in schools?
government mandating the coverage of care from commercial insurance. And so
Okay.
government mandated care, if you went to 1995 and you tried to
Mhm.
get your local Blue Cross Blue Shield plan to pay for your autism therapy treatment, say no, because they didn't have to. Now
Mhm.
government in all 50 states mandates that therapy is covered under insurance plans. And
Okay.
so given that it's mandated in all 50 states, and the government itself is paying for care through Medicaid. There's just a lot more jobs, and then people get into the field as an RBT, they like it, they want to go become a BCBA. It's that kind of next step in a career path. There are a lot of ABA master's programs now, and so I think that the number of BCBAs has increased pretty steadily over the last few years, and I
Mhm.
expect it will continue to, just because again, it's a challenging line of work, but it's a very fulfilling line of work. And people really do care deeply about their clients and the kids and the work that they do. And I don't think anybody at Ally ever goes home wondering if they're making a difference in the world. It's like they go home knowing that they're changing that kid's life and that whole family's trajectory.
Yeah, that's for sure. And Michael, to end things, do you have any advice for someone who's very passionate about helping autistic children and families and is thinking of starting a clinic or a business of providing these services?
So maybe a bit of a recurring theme through the talk, but think deeply about who you're going to partner with and find that right person to partner with. It's very hard to start anything new. And so finding somebody who is value aligned with you on what you want to do and what you want to build. And this could be literally a business partner, or it can just be your first few employees. I think that some of these things may sound obvious, but sometimes people will be like, hey, I like doing this, so maybe I'll start my own business. Take some time to research the unit economics of the field and understanding what the financial profile looks like, and then making sure that your structuring approach is financially viable in serving the kids you want to serve. If you're structuring something where you're going to lose money every time you treat a kid, then you're not going to be able to treat any kids. And so just taking a step back and walking through like, hey, financially, how do I make this, whatever program you're going after, how do I make this work? What do I need to have in place? And then who do I partner with to do that and make that real? I would say that some of the things that I thought would be super hard getting started didn't end up being as hard as I thought. So like dealing with the insurance payers and getting paid is certainly hard work, but it's not maybe the insurmountable wall that I thought it was getting started.
Mhm.
And some of the other pieces that I didn't put a lot of thought into, like the people management piece, ended up being very material. Um, Autism care is generally a very operationally heavy business. You have a lot of people on your team relative to the size of your business. And so just when you're managing large groups of people, you need to have good policies in place, good procedures in place. And so, I would think through that, and then also just think through where do you want to exist in the market, and what band of services do you want to provide, and how do you be excellent at that? And I think that focus helps get to an excellent service provisioning, as opposed to taking the more shotgun approach of, there's obviously nothing wrong with wanting to help everybody, but if you try to be all things to all people, it might be a well-intentioned thing, but you'll likely be just okay to everyone instead of the best to the group that you're trying to serve. So yeah, happy if anyone reaches out, happy to chat through that further if somebody's thinking of doing that.
Oh, thank you. That's very kind of you. And just to lighten the mood a little bit, because we've been talking about work and business, and I want to ask you, did you ever in your journey since 2019 have a funny or a fun incident while you were setting up the business?
Oh, man, you're putting me on blast. I mean, I've had tons of fun over the years. It's just, the team's been a joy to work with. I'm trying to think of something that's not just like a context heavy inside story that would be funny to the viewers.
Let's put it this way. What's been the most fun part of your journey?
Without a doubt, I'd say two things have been most fun. Early on, when I was running that first clinic, I was the person, I was front desk. And so you'd have parents come in and they're seeing their kids make progress that they never thought was possible. And they're tearing up and they're crying and they're thanking you. And so that was just incredible, right? I mean, to be like, okay, I started something that has changed this kid's life, has changed this parent's life, has changed the whole family's trajectory. That was incredibly rewarding. Now that we're bigger, I get a little bit less of that, but I get to hear about that through kind of all the different clinics we're doing and the feedback from all the different families. And so that's an incredible piece of doing Ally. The other piece is just anytime you hire somebody, and we hire a lot of people who are fresh out of school and super smart and super talented, and they do something kind of beyond your expectations. That's probably my favorite part of running a business. It's like everyone say, the hardest thing about a business is the people, but also the best thing is the people. And so just seeing the passion and energy and ownership that a lot of my teammates put into Ally to make it their own, to really drive it forward, and to take something and not just kind of like do the minimum, but to really do an awesome job because they believe in the mission, they believe in all of the lives we're changing, has just been kind of a humbling and incredible experience.
Totally makes sense. Thank you so much, Michael. This has been such an enriching podcast. I've learned so much. And are you okay with me putting your email address and link to your website in the podcast description?
Of course.
Thank you so much. All right, this was Rishanka Jones, and I had Michael with me today talking about his business, Ally Behavior. He is running 10 centers across Washington, D.C. area, helping autistic children. If you think this podcast has been helpful in any way, please like, subscribe, and share. Until then, this is Rishanka Jones signing off.